Hey, Ed Stetzer here. This is another episode installment of Exponential Backstage. We have a couple of guests in just a moment. Before I do, let me just remind you, this is brought to you by the Exponential Conference, really the Exponential Movement, a desire to increase church planting in North America and ultimately around the world. We're excited about what that looks like. We've been using a theme called hero making. This will be by book Dave Ferguson and Warren Bird work together. What does it mean to be a hero maker? Well, you're raising up other leaders to make a greater gospel difference, right? So that's been our focus. We've got a whole series of these webinars. I'm Ed Stetzer, your host, and I'm broadcasting live here from the Send Institute in the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College, where I serve as the executive director. I want to remind you that we're talking about, and we're going to invite you to some regionals, right? Regional conferences. Let's put those up on the screen, Brooks, so people can take a look. These are the regional conferences that we have coming up. Washington, D.C. is just around the corner. SoCal, Bay Area, Houston, Chicago, and New York, all places you can connect. Our guests will be at some of those, and I'll be talking about those as well. Let me remind you that if you want to engage in conversation with us, go to the Exponential website. There's a little chat box. You click on that chat box, you can ask us questions and dialogue with us. Also, we now can do that at Facebook Live. So if you're watching at Facebook Live now, you can put comments or questions inside the comment stream. We'll be able to see them. Brooks and our team will feed them to me and also to our guests. Let me also remind you, if you're watching on Facebook, even if you're not watching it live, you can like and share, because we want to encourage you to do that. We've got a lot of good wisdom coming from these Exponential Backstage webinars, and so we want you to like and share now whenever you're watching this, if you're watching this when we're broadcasting, or later as well. So again, we've got some guests today. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. I want to let you know what we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about, again, the 5 practices of a hero maker. We're going to focus specifically today on kingdom building. What does it mean to build the kingdom of God? So my first guest is Brian Loritz, old friend, a lead pastor of Abundant Life Church in Silicon Valley, serves as president of the Kainos Movement, an organization committed to seeing multi-ethnic become the new normal in our world. In addition to these positions, he's on the board of trustees for Biola University and husband of Corey and father of 3. And so we are so glad that you are here, Brian. Good to see you. Good. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ed. I'm noticing Albert just got on as well, so it's great to be here with you, friend.
Well, good. Let me introduce Albert then. Albert is the founder and lead pastor of Fellowship Monrovia from Sweet Home Church of Christ Holiness USA in Pearl, Mississippi, to Lake Avenue in church in Pasadena. Albert Tate has been preaching the gospel to people of all ages and races. Hearing call from God, he and his wife, La Rosa, planted Fellowship Monrovia, a gospel-centered, multi-ethnic, intergenerational church in January 2012. So good to see you, Albert. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Ed, Brian. Good to see you guys.
Good to see you. But hey, fun fact, I didn't know that you were Church of Christ Holiness. So you know Emery Lindsay and those guys?
Oh, yeah. I grew up under those guys, Bishop Emery Lindsay, and oh, yeah, great guys.
Yeah, so I did some coaching and consulting with the bishops of that movement. And then I was just, Emery asked me to engage them. We had a good meeting, I spent a day with them. And then about 3 years later, I show up at a board of trustees meeting at Wheaton College, and there's Emery Lindsay. So it was a good thing I said yes to his request a few years before. So
anyway, good. Your boss now.
He is my boss. All right, so good to see you guys. Thanks so much for joining us. All friends here. So for those of you watching, we'll have a little bit of banter as we go. But let me mention too, I should mention Albert serves on the board of trustees at Azusa Pacific and the Fuller Youth Institute. And he was recently published in Letters to a Birmingham Jail, a response to the words and dreams of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to start by throwing a question to you, Brian, about your newest book. It's actually Insider Outsider, My Journey as a Stranger in White Evangelicalism and My Hope for Us All. What is your hope for us all, Brian Loritz?
Yeah, so I was just encouraged to kind of write my memoir, but these are, as we know, these are really divisive times. And so I write it with a view towards my experience in various theological circles, whether it be Bible college, seminary days, the Black church, my journey into multi-ethnicity, and along the way, just some experiences I've had for the purpose of trying to get people to avoid some of the mistakes that I encountered and trying to foster unity as well. So we cover the gamut. I've got an essay in there about the Donald Trump era. I got an essay in there about called Higher Learning, some things that I've learned and how theology can trip us up when not done in community. So I'm looking forward to it.
Good, good, good. Excited about it as well. So, Albert, tell us a little bit about your recently published Letters to a Birmingham Jail. For those who don't know, Letters from a Birmingham Jail is a very famous series of treatises written to white moderate clergy and others. And so you're responding here. So tell us what your book is about, Albert.
Well, actually, this is a book that Brian invited me to participate and contribute to a couple of years ago, and it's a response to Dr. King's letter now, kind of giving a perspective from the 21st century on our thoughts concerning the issues raised in that letter. One of which being that the 11 o'clock hour is still the most segregated hour of the week. And we speak to that, speak to progress, speak to some of the challenges, and speak to some of the things that we've been trying to accomplish since he wrote that letter, since Dr. King wrote that letter. So it's kind of a writing back to his legacy and to his memory.
Awesome.
A little known fact, Albert came up with the title.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice little twist. I like that. I actually read it I think I said the first time Letters from, and then I looked again, it was Letters to. All right, so fun fact, the last time I think the three of us were together in one room was actually a broadcast from the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. And I know we're going to be talking about kingdom building. I think these are kingdom ideas, and these are about kingdom ethics. So Brian, you asked me to co-host that broadcast. I think it was seen by just all kinds of people all over the world, at least by the mail I got. Not everyone was thrilled with everything. I'm sure you got a mix too, but I think by and large, seen as a very, very helpful conversation. We were both a part of it. What were you trying to do there, Brian, and what did you see happen?
Yeah, that was back in 2014, kind of when that first wave of, police shootings. I think Ferguson had just happened that August.
Yeah, I think it was Ferguson and, of course, Trayvon Martin, but I think it was kind of right after Ferguson was where the idea came together.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Eric Garner was somewhere in there as well. Yeah. And I was just like, man, I think where is the Christian voice in this? We were hearing a lot from pundits, so on and so forth. So I just felt like if we could get a multi-ethnic cohort of Christian leaders together in a historic place like the National Civil Rights Museum. Of course, they took the old Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated and redid it. So I just thought the venue was powerful. Having people like you and Albert and Chandler and a host of others was powerful. It was also multi-generational. Piper was in the mix and a few others. And to just have the conversation, and then you were with Lifeway at the time, were so gracious to stream it for us. I just felt like we needed to get together in a room and just share.
Well, let's talk about this, because I've been told that we're not supposed to care about social justice. We're just supposed to care about preaching the gospel. I don't know. That's just kind of in the water right now. I heard someone telling us all that. So why care about this thing? Why not just preach? Albert, go to you. Why not just preach?
Well, I'm just wondering who told you that. Was that John MacArthur that told you?
I could be. I don't even know. I've seen it from more than one person, but you tell me. What do you think?
Well, I mean, nobody's told me that, so that's why I was just wondering.
You got to get out more, man. You got to make some friends. So
I don't need them kind of friends.
I've seen it all over Twitter. I'd say probably on a given day, about 10 people a day for the last 3 weeks have told me about that. So what do you think? You think we should just preach the gospel? How do we care? Should we care about social justice?
I think words are everything, and understanding what we say. So I think a part of it is just getting clarity. But when I see Jesus bringing healing and deliverance to people who have been broken, not only by sin, but by the systems at play. I think about the woman at the well. Was it social justice what she did for her? She'd say he set her free from her own personal sin and struggle, but also from a system that had her walking in a life of shame and hiding. So I think she would say that impacted her both in a spiritual vertical perspective, but also in a horizontal perspective. And I would include that in the definition of social justice. So maybe understanding the terms. I don't know where people are coming from. I hadn't really said in that conversation, but I see social justice inextricably tied to the deliverance and the freedom that the gospel brings. It breaks all of those barriers. Impacts
systemic issues as well. Let's, Brian, have you just touch on that? I don't want to jump into some of the questions specific over this webinar.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, right, I'm with Albert. We just need clarity on that phrase. It's been politicized.
Yeah.
So, but if you buy if you mean by social relational, then of course the gospel is relational. I'm supposed to love other people, serve other people, forgive other people. I mean, the Bible knows no concept of an individualized gospel that doesn't stretch out in relationship to others and touches the totality of who they are, spirit and body. So I don't know how we do gospel outside of reaching across economic lines, ethnic lines, whatever it may be. That's what the gospel does. By very definition, it's social for God.
Yeah, but I think you're saying reaching across. I agree. But is there a place in the mission of the church and the call of Jesus followers? I think people who would talk about social justice would be all over the spectrum. It's like grace. Do we stop using the word grace because people use it badly?
Right.
But I think what we're talking about here is, should Christians, as a priority of the mission of the church, seek to address issues of systemic injustice? That's where the social injustice is. Or should they primarily focus on conversion and discipleship? How does that work? Is it a both ends, either or? How does that work?
Well, see,
Go ahead.
No, it just depends on who you're talking to. I think when you're talking to historically oppressed groups like minorities, we would say absolutely. But see, the narrative, and this is what Divided by Faith touches on, the early 2000s book, where these sociologists who love Jesus said conservative evangelicals have a narrative where injustice is just personal, it's not systemic. And then Robin DiAngelo, in her book, White Fragility, which is powerful. She's a white PhD, by the way. She talks about how whites don't see themselves as a collective group in solidarity with each other. Instead, whites see themselves as a collection of individuals, right? And so when you see yourself as a collection of individuals, the next domino to fall is you don't see yourself as being a part of a larger holistic narrative that includes culpability to such things as systemic injustice. But when you're a minority, we see ourselves in solidarity with one another. So when something bad happens in Ferguson or wherever it may be, we feel that personally and we want to speak to it and fight against the injustice. And so I just think it's just two different ways of seeing it. I personally think the minority narrative in this case is closer to the biblical truth that there is systemic injustice that needs to be addressed.
Albert, what do you want to add? Well, before you add, though, let me say that the book White Fragility is worth a read. You won't agree. I don't agree with everything in it, but it does open your eyes to some things. Albert, what would you say?
Well, I think just that. I think this is the power of having the conversation in a multi-ethnic context, because I would even argue that most of the people making the argument, Ed, that you're bringing up, my assumption, and you can correct it if it's wrong, those 10 tweets a day or those 10 thoughts a day, or how it keeps coming up, those usually come up with from people of majority culture, not people of color. For people of color, this isn't, and I'm speaking stereotypically broadly here, but it's not something that raises a red flag. To be honest, the question of not doing it raises a red flag. To corporately go against systems that oppress people is what people of color have been doing throughout in the church for the whole time. So that for that not to be a part of our church dialogue and conversation is foreign to the local Black church, especially when we go back decades, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Love it. Love it. So helpful. And thank you for letting me kind of jump in on that. You know, one of the things that I think it's important that white evangelicals like me, in moments where there's maybe words being said about injustice or systemic issues, whatever it may be, that we listen. Brian, one of the articles that you wrote in the series I launched after Ferguson was called A Time to Listen. You turned into the broadcast was a time to speak, but a time to listen was, how do we, I mean, here's Albert Tate and Brian Loritz. You're going to listen to them at Exponential, but when it comes to issues of racial injustice, you tend not to listen to them when that may be the most important time for you to listen to them. And so again, this is a little bit of a diversion from what our original plan and discussion was, but I just couldn't miss the opportunity to have two.
Hey, let's give the people their money's worth. Let's just give it all. Let's give it all to them.
Get it all done. Get it all done. But let's jump into our conversation. Webinars around 5 things: multiplication thinking, permission giving. These are the 5 essential practices for leaders to multiply leaders: multiplication thinking, permission giving, disciple multiplying, gift activating, kingdom building. And this one we're specifically going to talk about is a shift in counting. Kingdom building is a shift in counting. Instead of counting people who show up at my thing, you begin to count leaders that maybe you send out to do God's thing. And again, that's key. What it looks like, the idea of winning is not necessarily our seating capacity, but our sending capacity as well. So we're going to talk about some of these things, and particularly about being a hero maker. So let's jump in with that. Brian, start with you. Today we're talking about what it means to be a hero maker, especially as a church leader. We become kingdom builders. Who in your life kind of spoke into and gave you permission to be the kind of leader and helped you become the leader you are today? What about you personally?
You know, I'm extremely blessed. I just feel like I've just had a whole tribe around me, and I've just been just so surrounded by a phenomenal group of leaders. I almost feel embarrassed by it. So it starts with my own dad. You know, I didn't have to look outside my home to just see what a godly person looked like, who was a phenomenal leader in a Christian space. At the time it was Campus Crusade for Christ. Now it's Cru. And because he happened to be so well known, that got me into rooms I had no business being in. So that bled into a relationship with Dr. Tony Evans, who mentored me fresh out of college. Bishop Kenneth Ulmer, Faithful Central Bible Church, is my godfather. I sit up under him. Today, in a couple hours, I'll be on a mentoring call with Dennis Rainey, former CEO of Family Life. So these are all individuals who speak profoundly in my life and have helped to shape every dimension of my life.
How fascinating. Do you ever, what would you say to somebody, this is just random, man, I hear that list and I'm like, sign me up for that list of mentors. What would you say to somebody said, I don't have anyone like that to mentor in my life? I mean, Brian gets all the good, Brian's taking all the good ones. What would you say to somebody who doesn't get access maybe to some of those relationships?
Yeah, like I said, Ed, I mean, I'm the first to tell you, I don't deserve that at all. But if you just back it up a generation, those great men would be in the same position that that person you're talking about is saying. They didn't have that. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So obviously there's hope.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, but same question to you, Albert. Who are your hero makers who helped you understood what it meant to be a leader and multiply your leadership?
Yeah, you know, when you talk about the Church of Christ Holiness, that's where I grew up. Both of my grandfathers were pastors. Both of them put in over 30 years of pastoral ministry. So I grew up watching them lead small rural churches, pastoring 2 churches. This was back in the day when they pastored one church on the first and third Sunday, another church on the second and fourth Sunday, and they all had to drive an hour to each of those churches.
Wow.
So I saw that happening, and I saw that kind of leadership, sacrificial leadership, servanthood leadership modeled early on. My great grandmother planted the church that I grew up in. Started in her rural house there in Pearl, Mississippi, and it's became Sweet Home Church, the church that I grew up in. So great Christian leaders there. But then fast forward, I mean, Bryan Loritts, what I love, as you hear his list of mentors, he then passed on, there's probably a tribe of about 50 men that Bryan has put his hands on and unleashed and working in some kind of ministry capacity in a part of the country. And I'm privileged to be a part of that tribe as well. Bryan, because of Bryan, my relationship with him, I ended up in rooms that I didn't have any business being in, that I wasn't qualified to be in, and he pushed me in spaces and places that I wouldn't have been in before. So what I love about him is what he received, he passed on exponentially to me. See what I did?
I just
exponential in there.
Yeah, I caught that.
Kind of a hero maker. Bing, every
it ain't
time
all about preaching with you, Albert.
Hey.
Did you see my fancy thing right here?
It's about the sponsorships, baby. We got to get
do it, man. Got to make the magic happen. Got to make the magic happen. All right. So, and I just can't believe I didn't know you were Church of Christ Holiness. That's going to bug me all day long. All right. So,
it bugs me too, Ed. It bugs me too.
It bugs you. Get up every day. Relax, take some beverage. Don't worry about the fact that we're in the middle of a live webcast and millions are watching. You need to run to the restroom real quick. We'll wait.
Hey, look, man, you better not be giving Jamba Juice free advertising.
Is it Jamba Juice?
I hadn't shown the logo at all. I know what I'm doing. This is an exponential juice, okay?
Exponential juice. We can make some money from Jamba.
Stadia on the other side. Exponential and Stadia. Those are my sponsors.
That's awesome. All right, back to the questions. So in the Hero Maker book, Ferguson talks about kingdom building, one of the 5 essential practices. He says, I'm going to read a quote, the practice of kingdom building is a shift from counting people who show up to my thing to counting the leaders who go out and do God's thing. Kingdom building requires we reject old ways of measuring success and use simple tools like a scoreboard to measure the number of current disciple makers and total disciple makers. So, question for this, Brian, you've served there, different ministry contexts. Did you ever get around the places that maybe we're measuring the wrong things, and what did you do if that's the case?
Yeah, so I definitely get what Ferguson's saying. I really get that. And I need to chew on that for a while. For sure, it's wrong if my identity and self-esteem is based off of how many people come to my quote, end quote thing. So I think he's spot on there. The other thing I would say I really resonate with is, look, you're going to get a whole bunch of people who show up on Sunday who really aren't going to buy into the core of what that church is about. And I understand that and I get it. But as far as actually equipping, mobilizing, and unleashing people, I wouldn't necessarily throw the whole numbers thing out.
Good, tell me more.
I think it's important for me as a leader to know, okay, I've got X amount who show up on Sunday morning. Then that number gets smaller probably when you talk about those who are actively engaged in your church, a part of a growth group, serving in a ministry, yada, yada, yada. And Paul talks about taking people, Colossians chapter 1, from immaturity to maturity. And I think a sign of immaturity is a consumer spirit, where you do get people who show up to your thing and who are around and who are really being touched by it. But you got to come alongside of them and figure out a way, how can I inspire you to go from a consumer to a contributor to actually buy into what's happening here? And
Albert, don't you worry about that, man. You need to go anything you need. You need to go visit with your family, take that call. You see Albert picking up the phone, saying, "What's up?"
I'm a full-time pastor, and my sheep depend on me.
Oh, man, I'm going to call you right now.
They are.
I'm going to call Brian, see if he has his phone on.
To access the shepherd.
All right, I'm calling you, Brian, right now. See if your phone's off.
It's on airplane mode, bro.
See, that's what people do when they come on a broadcast. They put their phone on airplane mode. Sweet mother of pearl.
I've got sheep desiring the shepherd in this.
And they can't wait. They can't wait to the end of this webcast. They need you right now.
There's a line outside, bro.
Can you finish, Brian, you were really into something good before that Jamba Juice break. But
yeah. So I would say, listen, in principle, look, to just make it brief, I totally agree with Ferguson. I think the church growth movement, which numbers it just seemed to be the end all be all.
Yeah.
We've got to get to this number and break through this plateau, so on and so forth. I mean, just look around. I don't necessarily see a whole bunch of fruit that came out of that. So I definitely see what he's saying. I'm just saying there's a place, like, if I'm not counting people, how can I staff well to equip people? How can I staff well to maximize it? That's
you want to be careful not to overreact. There's a little bit like it's all now. And I think I'd agree. I mean, again, we're talking about Ferguson. It's like his webcast. So let's say bad things about him. But I'm just down the road from him. And I know he's got a growing, vibrant church. And I'm pretty sure he knows the attendance of that growing, vibrant church.
Yes.
One thing I love about him, he's also, how many people are sending out is really very central to them. So I think we want to be careful. It's not an overreaction that growing church is bad, or else Ferguson, who wrote this book, is kind of a hypocrite. But he's reaching a lot of people there. So praise God for that as well.
Yeah,
so I like it.
Got it.
For sure. Albert, let me come back to you, Albert. What are some tensions that a senior leader must deal with honestly and accurately to kind of see how they're doing it, sending people out and being about kingdom work? Are there things in your heart or life that you try to do that?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of identity stuff that's got to be worked out. Even when you talk about the numbers, man, usually the folks saying don't worry about the numbers are people that got numbers.
Yeah.
I know what it's like to pastor 7 people and to go to a Bible study and have, nobody come, or show up on Sunday morning, it's 10, 14 people and half of them are your family. So I feel like there's a healthy dialogue around numbers, as well as knowing what to do when you get the numbers. And that's where Ferguson comes in and says, how many did you see Sunday? The question is, how many of what did you see? Did you see disciples? Did you see leaders? What are you doing with the numbers as you have them? So a healthy tension of dealing with and building developing that conversation. The other big thing, to be honest, Ed, that I struggle with when it comes to sending people out in leadership pipeline and that kind of stuff, you got your own sphere of what you can personally do with guys that you pour into. But the bigger question for me is building a framework, an infrastructure that you have an organization that automatically leans towards discipleship making and leader unleashing. So a lot of times if your infrastructure is built towards the weekend, or if your infrastructure is built towards, there's an inherent infrastructure that's got to be in place, so that way it multiplies all the time and it's not just based off of your personality or your emotional reaction to a theme for that year, like Hero Makers this year, so we're going to do this year. But then 2 years next year now, it's going to be Break the Chains, although that don't really sound like nothing Ferguson would do. But, you know, you just never know. You know, I don't know where this thing is going. But
I don't even know how to respond to you sometimes, Albert.
But that's the bigger thing, getting a infrastructure and a staff structure and a church culture that's all about discipleship making and multiplication. That's the bigger challenge.
Feels like you got more to say, Brian. Throw it in there.
Yeah, so I would just say at the place where I pastor, and I want to be careful how I say this, a decade ago it was 7,000 people. And a whole bunch of stuff happened. By the time I got here, it was 300 people. And so, I mean, it was one of those churches where, I mean, we're all about counting and, you know, adding services, and then just all of a sudden it just blew up. And now we're in a great rebuild and God's doing amazing things here. But it's even made me rethink, like I've had to beat the drums with my people and just tell them, I'm not here to return you back to those quote unquote glory days where it was just all about numbers. So that's what I'm saying. I really resonate with what Ferguson's saying.
Nice. All right. So talk to me a little bit again. This is, you know, because I have the two of you here, it's kind of amazing to talk about this in different contexts. So 2 books on church planting in the African-American context. One's by Ratliff and Cox. I think it's Church Planting in the African-American Community. Jose L. Francis, maybe Church Planting in the African-American Context. Both have a recurring theme that sending out people. Now, again, obviously I'm not African-American, so I can't speak for a community. Wouldn't try to if I could. But what both of them sort of said is that sending out, I'm paraphrasing because they didn't use the exact term sending out, but that's our theme, that sometimes church planting in an African-American context is different because starting a new church in a community can be seen as an insult to an established church, and the associate minister system, which I need you to explain, but the associate minister system sometimes can preclude sending out people and multiplying church planters. True? What do you think? Again, I'm just drawing from their writing. What do you think? Either of you.
Well, I mean, I think like my executive pastor was a former member of the Saddleback staff, and his job was to launch campuses for Saddleback. So he was one of the first ones that they sent out, their San Clemente campus and yada, yada, yada. And he would say that, man, when folks saw their church coming into their neighborhoods, people were upset and ticked and not very receptive at all to their campuses coming into town. So I think that's a overarching theme. I think most pastors are very territorial initially before they are kingdom. Just our humanity gets in the way. And I feel like, I don't think it's just the African-American church. I think most churches, when they see another big church coming into town or a small church or another pastor saying, I've got a vision for this city, I think we all get a little pushed off by it. So I think it's true in African-American context. I think it's true in the majority culture context as well.
Anything you'd add, Brian?
Yeah, so I'll add a different piece to it, and I want to be careful. You know, my roots are in the Black church, love the Black church, always assumed I'd pastor a Black church until God did some radically different stuff with me. The perception that I get from the Black pastors that I run with, who are my father's generation, is the varsity side of the church world is you get called to a church, you fight deacons, and you transition that church. Church planting, I had to do a whole lot of explaining. Now, what is that and why are you doing it? Because in a lot of circles, church planting was something you did on the heels of a church split.
Yeah.
And so, you fell out with the people from New Bethel. So you went down the street and you started Greater New Bethel. And that's just what you did. So I had to do a lot of explaining, even in fundraising when we started fellowship, because the people I knew from that demographic, it was almost like they were looking at me like, God's gifted you so much more than just planting a church. Like, why aren't you candidating somewhere?
Yeah.
So that's the perspective I got.
Yeah,
And it was the prime job for a young guy coming out of seminary. It wasn't one of those things to you go and, start from scratch. You go and get you a church that's established that can support you and sustain you. So for the leaders, that was the vision. That was the ideal job.
So if you're interested more, because I haven't written on the subject, but the book I just mentioned is Church Planting in the African American Context. That's Ozell Francis. And the other one is Ratliff and Cox book by, I think it's Church Planting in the African American Community. Again, important stuff, and different cultures, approach things in different ways. But what all of them need to have in common is the necessity, of course, of sending out, of being that Antioch kind of church. So start back with you, Albert. So, how have you sought to Antioch up your church and be that kind of sending church? What are some ways you've done that?
Well, one of the first things that we did is made sure that we made church planting a part of our DNA out of the gate. So we participated. We'll be 7 years old in January, and we've participated in about 7 to 8 church plants so far in our time together. Am I boring you, Ed? You just yawned.
No.
My little church and my little church plant that I'm doing is not impressive to you.
First of all, that wasn't a yawn, just so you know. That was a stretch. I have back pain, so I'm going, but thanks for noticing the back pain.
It's the back pain. Oh,
Here, I'm sorry. Who's got an ice pack on their back right now? You want to keep talking smack to me?
Hey. How you deal with your hangovers from Labor Day is between you and yourself. Don't bring me into your ice pack.
No. His back pain is coming from that interim pastor gig he's got.
Oh, man, that's 2 years, man, 2 years. I've been the interim pastor of Moody Church longer, and 2 of their pastors were the pastor of Moody Church.
No, but I mean, even this past Sunday, we sent out 2 guys from our church. They've been with us for about 4 years, and they're going to plant a church in Milk Wilshire in LA. So we're sending those guys out. They're taking some families from our church, and they're going to start doing it. So making it a part of the DNA and putting action to your words.
Good. I want you to answer that too in just a second, Brian. But let me remind everybody, you're watching Exponential Backstage. I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm with Albert Tate, and I'm with Brian Loritz, and we're talking about how we might be kingdom building by sending out others, by multiplying. Both of these gentlemen will be sharing at Exponential conferences. Brooks, if you'd put up the screen to list those coming up. Brian, you'll be speaking at both the Southern California Regional, October 2 through 4, and the Bay Area Regional, October 22nd through 23rd. Albert was at the national conference with me and others in Orlando. He'll be at regional events this fall. But here's the question. You guys are also doing kind of a special event, an Exponential After Hours. And this is going to be with Albert Tate, special guest Brian Loritz. And you're going to host, let me just share a little bit about it. They're hosting a special event called After Hours with Albert Tate. The live interactive conversation will focus on the gospel, the church, and race. Albert will be interviewing Pastor Brian, author of the book Insider Outsider, My Journey as a Stranger in White Evangelicalism, I hope for us all. And then both Loritz book and Exponential After Hours will dive deeper into what it's like to be a person of color in predominantly white evangelical spaces. Let me encourage you. I really think that's a conversation we need to have. So it's a timely conversation. You'll want to be a part of it. It's Exponential After Hours with Albert Tate, Wednesday, October 3rd, 2018, from 7:30 to 9 at Mariners Church in Irvine, California. It's part of the Exponential Regional Conference in Southern California. A good deal. And the other dates are listed up there, the regional events as well. By the way, you guys know who the new pastor of Mariners Church is, don't you?
Geiger.
Eric Geiger. You believe Eric Geiger has left Lifeway? He couldn't stay. Once I left, he said, I can't live if living is without you. Not the Mariah Carey version, but the original. But anyway.
Should be very interesting.
So he's going to be there. That's kind of fun and exciting. All right, so back to you, Brian, kind of following up on his question. Talk to me about how you've gotten involved in sending and building the kingdom by sending.
Well, 2 things. Currently, one of the things that we're doing with Kainos is we're doing these Kainos cohorts, which is a 3-day gathering of 12 leaders from anywhere around the world. They come to the Bay Area, and we talk multi-ethnic church planting. So that's one specific way we're doing it. We've got one coming up in October, another one coming up in the spring. And then we're looking to establish a residency program here at my current church that's going to be similar to what we did in Memphis. I just had a real heart for developing what I call C2 leaders, which I walk through that in my book, Right Color, Wrong Culture. C2 leaders are leaders, who can walk into different settings without losing who they are. And I think we see that in the Apostle Paul. And so we had a residency program that took about 70 people through it. Most of them were people of color. We paid for their seminary, gave them a stipend, and then we launched them out into full-time vocational ministry. So that was a part of our DNA. Year one, when there was 26 people in a living room, we had established a residency program.
Wow. Wow. Love that. Love that. Good deal. Let me remind everybody who's watching, you can ask questions. We're going to take questions now. If you're at the Exponential page, exponential.org, you can see the chat box. Click on that. You can ask questions. They'll feed them to me. Also, if you're at Facebook watching live now, let me encourage you, like and share, because it gets this free resource and really a lot of helpful conversation. One of my favorite conversations we've had thus far is with these two men who've been friends for a while. Like or share. If you're watching this later, maybe you're not watching it live, still like or share so other people can see and be aware. Let's take some questions and we'll have a few minutes. So if you have a question, send yours in now. First one's from Edward Jackson. How do you balance kingdom building from the perspective of building other leaders and at the same time continue to have your own personal ministry where you're helping people to come in the right relationship with Jesus? Albert, you were talking a little smack about the sheep, but let's pursue that for just a second. How do you do the kind of things you're doing? You said 7 church plants, you're raising up other leaders while still ministering to the sheep that Christ has given you to be a shepherd over.
Yeah. Well, I think I just get real, I don't know, I'm real slow to compartmentalize it. I think it's all the same. I think as we do 7 churches, it's imperative that I integrate, our sheep, for lack of a better terminology, our congregation in that process. So they're very much involved in that vision, because not only should the church be sending out, but they themselves should be living missionally. So I feel like it's modeling that missional lifestyle. How are they duplicating themselves? Who are they pouring into? Who are they investing time in? As you see our church corporately investing in other ministries, how are you personally and your family investing the gospel in other people? So we integrate them into those conversations and give them a front row seat into what it is to live missionally through our organization, through our church, but also as a model for us as families to begin to ask those questions, to live it out personally.
It's a good word. Good. We have a question, Brian, I'm going to send to you. Scott Kirksey says, as a multi-site pastor in Redwood City, attempting to reach more of the Latino community that live here, how can you speak into what you do at your church to reach minorities in your community? I'm guessing Scott might be a person of color. I'm assuming might be an Anglo, but how would he reach minorities in his community?
I think he would have to answer the question. Is he going after first generation or second and subsequent generations? That's huge because then you're getting to issues of language. I actually made a hard call here at our church. We decided not to go after first generation. I'm not
first generation Latinos you're talking about.
First generation Latinos or anyone
really
where there was a language.
Just linguistically, it would be too.
Yes, because we value this coming together, and everything I've seen, they either had their own separate service or were some kind of outsider group. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that that wasn't for us. So you got to define who you're trying to go after. And then, of course, you got to address issues of music. You got to address issues of staffing. Do you have staff that represent the kind of ethnic demographics you're actually trying to go after? And you're going to have to become an incredible student, read a bunch of books, have a bunch of experiences, have friends who are authentically in that demographic as well. And give yourself time. It takes some time.
Okay, good word. All right, so one question just came in. And let me remind you got just a couple of, Scott Jackson says, I'm a 3rd generation Latino, hoping to reach the English speaking. So would you change that answer at all on the other, go in the other direction? I apologize, Scott, for reading into that in a wrong way. Would you change the answer at all?
So he's a Hispanic trying to reach Hispanic?
Yeah, he says he's a 3rd generation Latino, hoping to reach the English speaking.
Well, so living in the Bay Area, I'm right down the road from him in Redwood City. And I would just say, I'm having the same kind of difficulty because our church started off as an all African-American church back in the late 80s. Now it's thoroughly multi-ethnic. And I tell my staff all the time, African Americans are leaving the Bay. So I cannot build out this church for a long run in the future by focusing on African Americans. I would have him do his demographic studies. Silicon Valley is so cost prohibitive. I'm not sure what the numbers are on Hispanics, and if they're growing, declining, or staying the same. He would need to do some research, because what he doesn't want to do is put a lot of energy into people who are just leaving. I know that's hard to say, but that's exactly where I am with the African American community.
Okay, fair enough. Good, helpful. And again, thanks for forgiving me, Scott, for not knowing. I must confess, though, Kirksey is the very definition of an Anglo name. But again, it reminds us people I'm Irish and my last name's Dutch, so you never know how that might be. Let's go to Jason Schuler on Facebook Live. And by the way, we've got time for a couple more questions. If you want to throw them in, this is the time. Jason Schuler, what books are you guys currently reading? Personal growth, pastoral leadership, et cetera. Start with you, Albert.
I just picked up, both of you guys have already referenced it, so I feel like I'm behind the curve, but I just picked up White Fragility.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that, and that's been very inspiring and encouraging. So that's my latest read that I'm diving into.
I'm going to go to you, Brian, a second. The thing that surprised me, White Fragility helped me to understand a little why, because even when we did that series, Brian, you wrote that article in the series we did, A Time to Listen, and it just kind of blew up. I mean, we had people were mad at you, people were mad at me for publishing it, because you talked about, what does it mean to listen in spite of this or that? And it was super helpful. And it helped me understand why many people who have not been, for example, have lived in an African-American context and see themselves differently. Super helpful book. Again, you wouldn't agree with everything, but it'll make you think. So super helpful. By the way, Scott says, thanks. That's great. He's given us a good thank you there. So appreciate that, Scott. So to you, Brian, what books have you been reading?
Well, I just got finished White Fragility. Michael Kim, he's a preaching professor at Gordon Conwell, just came out with a great book called Intercultural Preaching.
Oh, cool.
How do you preach in such a way that's conducive to build a multi-ethnic audience? Phenomenal book. And then I got one I'm reading now by Tim Chester called Enjoying God.
Yeah.
It's a good one. So
Chester's a good guy.
Yeah.
Good deal. Okay, one other question come in. What's the top metric for healthy church growth? Either of you have an opinion? Is there a top metric for healthy church growth? Start with you, Brian.
I actually see it from the standpoint of leaders you're developing and sending out. I think that is, I'm not going to say that's the top, but that's right up there.
Which kind of fits in where the theme is today, and why we're asking you to be on here is leaders being sent out make such a difference. Now, again, none of us are in our 20s anymore. So maybe in our 20s, we didn't think as much about that, but this becomes such a key thing for all of us, is to be at every age and stage, those who develop and send out others. So I love that that's your answer. No pressure on you, Albert. What would your answer be?
No, I think I agree with that, but I also think the amount of people coming to Christ in a given year is still such an important thing.
Yeah.
So I look at baptisms and folks that are going through our disciple classes and actually being saturated in the gospel.
Yeah, love that. I think the difficulty with a question like this is I don't know that there's a top metric. I want to see, I'm sitting at Billy Graham Center. I want to see people come to faith in Jesus Christ, and I'm deeply passionate about it, but I want to raise up leaders and others. So when we did Transformational Church, we found that we had about 7 or 8 metrics that kind of came together to form a holistic way of looking at those things. Well, gentlemen, it is good to catch up with you. Sadly, not in the same room, but we'll be together again, I'm sure, soon. I'm Ed Stetzer. I've been hosting. This is Exponential Backstage. My guests have been the amazing Albert Tate and Brian Loritz. I've mentioned their books at the top of the show. I want to encourage you to grab a hold of those as well. Brooks, put up the Exponential Regionals again. These are the regionals that you can come and connect with, where you can come and connect with us. People are speaking, and specifically Albert and Brian. Backstage with Albert Tate is going to be at the Southern California Regional Conference, and then Brian and he will be engaging around issues of race, and Brian's new book I want to encourage you to get as well. Thanks for joining us at Exponential Backstage. Albert and Brian, thanks for your good time today. I appreciate you both. God bless.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good deal. We're out, guys. Thanks for joining us at Exponential Backstage.
Great. Now I'm going to my sheep now. I'm going to take care of my people. I got to
go for it, man. Go to it. What a way to end it. Go pastor. Brian, go pastor. I'm going to go pastor. See you guys.
All right. Bye-bye.